Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle.
Hello everyone, welcome to the 8th International Congress of Genç Ekonomistler. I'm Cethun from University of Ceyhun, and I will be moderating this session on the second day of the Congress. Our guest speaker in this session will be Professor Ceyhun Elgin from Bogazici University in Turkey, and he will be presenting his article, Minimum Wage in a High Inflation Economy, the Case of Turkey. I'd like to briefly provide some information about the session. In this session, we will be ask our guests 10 questions and learn about the main points of these articles. Each question will have a 100 seconds response time. After the questions are finished, we will ask our guests any question you may have. So, and now we begin. And thank you, Professor, your participating. So. That's very important after this Congress. Every year we will meet after this Congress area. So if you want to say anything, please, your turn.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. So first of all, I should mention that this is a joint paper with Dr. Adem Yavuz Elveren from Fitchburg State University and Izmir University of Economics, and Cem Oyvat from University of Greenwich. I believe this is a very fruitful, article that sparks a lot of debates, especially while we are getting very close to the announcement of the minimum wage for 2026.
Okay. If you want, we will start, Professor.
Of course.
Okay. The first question is, yes, how is the hypothesis on macro effects of minimum wage hikes in high inflation fields, and which economic theories or schools are referenced?
Okay, sure. So basically in this paper, we are trying to hypothesize that minimum wage increases have complex interconnected effects on inflation, aggregate demand, unemployment rate, and external trade balance. And we basically assume that in a high inflation economy, developing country economy like Turkey, where the minimum wage is really critical, especially as a social policy tool, because vast majority of the workforce are getting something around minimum wage, if not the exact minimum wage. So we must analyze it in broader macroeconomic impacts. And from a theoretical point of view, we try to ground our analysis in a post-Keynesian or a post-Kaleckian framework, which is, a heterodox school of thought, as you might be familiar with. And the core of the approach here is that inflation is not simply a monetary phenomenon, but it's also driven by distributive conflict, a struggle between workers and firms. This is not, very much in line with the neoclassical tradition, to be honest. And our paper also tries to engage heavily with the recent literature on profit-driven inflation or seller's inflation, so to speak. And we note that several studies on Turkey have found that rising profit markups, especially, not just wage increases, have been a major driver of the recent inflationary spiral.
Okay. The second question is how the Turkey's 2005 and 2024 monthly data, structural war method, and chosen variable make the study distinct from earlier literature?
Sure. In the paper, first, we provide a more comprehensive macroeconomic assessment first. Instead of isolating a single relationship or econometric model, the structural VAR, vector autoregression model, it allows us to simultaneously analyze the dynamic impacts of a minimum wage shock on a whole system of variables, bunch of variables, inflation, unemployment, capacity utilization, and trade balance. And that allows us, better identify the channels through which minimum wage might have an effect on the macroeconomy. And secondly, we also focus on the context of high inflation emerging economy like Turkey, as you know, which is characterized by a bunch of structural factors and market imperfections. And maybe thirdly, or a significant contribution is basically we are using two distinct inflation measures or price level change measures. One of them is the consumer price index of the official consumer price index of Turkstat, the Turkish Statistical Institute. And the other one is the cost of living index from the Istanbul Chamber of Commerce. This is especially important given the intense public debate in Turkey over the credibility and accuracy of the official inflation statistics. And we also use, relatively high frequency monthly data, not quarterly or annual data, but monthly data from 2005 2024. And that frequency is, I think, we believe, much better suited for capturing the rapid and short-term dynamics, and also especially the shock transmissions that are the characteristics of a high inflation economy like Turkey, compared to the averaged out or quarterly or annual data.
Okay, and the third question is how is the percentage then minimum wage plus 1 or 2 points is the inflation effects split into the cost channel versus demand channel in the analysis?
Sure. So basically, we try to decompose this effect by designing this SVAR, the structural VAR methodology, to include proxy variables for both channels. The cost channel basically refers to the direct impact of higher wages on firms' unit labor cost, which in the standard post-Keynesian framework, firms with market power pass on to the consumers to protect their profit margins, obviously. And our model tests this by measuring the direct, contemporaneous, and lagged impact of the wage shock on the two price indices that I just have mentioned as an answer to the previous question. And we found this effect to be statistically significant and moderate. The demand channel, on the other hand, suggests that minimum wage hikes could boost aggregate demand, as low-wage workers have a high propensity to consume, and this increased demand could theoretically pull prices up. And to test this, our model includes key demand-side variables such as capacity utilization rate, industrial production growth, and retail sales volume. And we are using them as proxy for demand, aggregate demand. And our central finding here is that the minimum wage increase had no statistically significant impact on any of these demand proxies. Therefore, by a process of elimination, we at the end ultimately conclude that the 1 to 2 percentage point inflationary effect we measured is driven almost entirely by the cost channel, not the demand channel.
Okay, I changed the next question. So the fourth question is in Turkey's high inflation, volatile FX settings, how do exchange rate shifts influence the wage inflation relationship?
The exchange rate plays an important role in our findings, actually. And first, and maybe most importantly, our analysis establishes that exchange rate movements are a far more powerful driver of inflation in Turkey than minimum wage adjustments. Because our models, we run several different models for robustness checks. They show overall that a 10% depreciation of the Turkish lira increases prices by approximately 8.7 to 9.1 percentage points over a year. And this impact is obviously substantially larger than the 1 to 2 point effect from a 10% minimum wage hike. And it confirms, we believe, that currency depreciation and imported inflation are the dominant factors in Turkey's inflation dynamics. Also, we tested for a direct causal link from wages to the currency, and we found that a 10% minimum wage increase had a very small and critically statistically insignificant effect on the exchange rate between US dollar and the Turkish lira. And that suggests that there is no really strong immediate direct pass-through from wage increases to currency depreciation. But we identified, on the other hand, an indirect route, which we call the trade balance channel. We found that minimum wage increases do lead to a statistically significant worsening of the trade balance. And not very much, but still, some worsening. And this deficit might be financed by capital flows in the short term, but still it can increase the economy's external fragility.
Okay, the fifth question. Yes, okay. With no effect on the demand side indicators, what methodological or data set limitation might explain these findings?
So this is basically a key finding, first of all. But of course, I very much agree that we need to discuss some potential limitations. The primary limitation could be the aggregation bias, obviously. We are using macro-level aggregated data for variables like industrial production, retail sales, etc. It's entirely possible that this aggregation is masking some heterogeneous effects, let's say, at the sectoral level, at the firm level even. For instance, a minimum wage hike, a minimum wage increase might be boosting demand in sectors, say, that serve low-income consumers, while simultaneously maybe depressing output in other sectors. And a second limitation potentially could be the high volatility of the data set. I mean, we are using monthly data, especially in the post-2018 period. This can be extremely noisy. I mean, because there has been a very volatile environment, as you know, in the Turkish economy after that period. I mean, in that case, in that environment, the marginal impact of a minimum wage change on demand might be, say, completely overshadowed by larger, more frequent shocks, say, such as currency crisis, sudden stops in capital flows, or major unorthodox policy changes, which we have all observed in the Turkish economy. I mean, this high volatility can make it very difficult for actually any econometric model, not only for our model, but for any econometric model to isolate a clean, statistically significant signal for the demand channel.
Okay. So the sixth question is, what is the macro and the policy significance of a negative 0.10 to negative 0.15 points unemployment change after the minimum wage increases?
Okay, so basically, yes, I mean, we mentioned a small decrease, but while our main results in the body of the paper basically point to a small change in the unemployment. And the conclusion which I will focus on here is basically the key significance of this finding is that the impact on unemployment is minimal. I mean, it's economically small. Okay, so a 0.10, 0.15 percentage point change following a 10% minimum wage increase is really, I mean, almost negligible, I should say, at the macroeconomic level, especially in an economy like Turkey, where the unemployment rate is in 2 digits. Maybe if we had a 3% unemployment rate, going from 3 to 3.15 could be more significant, but going from 10% to 10.15 is really almost negligible, I should say. And from an economic perspective, this result actually strongly challenges the traditional prediction that large minimum wage hike must lead to significant job losses, significant increase in the unemployment rate. I mean, I think our finding is more consistent with monopsonistic labor market theories, which basically argue that firms have wage setting power and raising the minimum wage has generally a minimal effect on employment or unemployment. From a policy perspective also, this is perhaps our most critical takeaway, because it implies that jobs versus wages trade-off is really not a major constraint for policymakers in Turkey. I mean, it can also mean that maybe minimum wage still is a viable tool for, say, pursuing social objectives, such as improving the welfare of low-wage workers, reducing poverty, and addressing income inequality, without leading to significant employment costs.
Okay. The last 4 questions, Professor. And so the 7th question is that how does the article evaluate minimum wage effects on the trade deficit in the labor market with high wage coverage?
I mean, we try to address this directly and empirically, actually, as we identified as a critical channel for an open economy like Turkey. Given that the minimum wage has a very high share in Turkey and acts as a benchmark for roughly 3/4 of the workforce, because 3/4 of the workforce receive a wage which is in between 50% below and 50% above the minimum wage in Turkey. And I mean, theoretically, basically, this can harm the price competitiveness of Turkish exports. And if it boosts consumption, it can also increase the demand for imports. And we tested, we explicitly included the seasonally adjusted trade balance as an endogenous variable in our expanded structural VAR model. And our results confirm this hypothesis, actually. We found that 10% increase in the minimum wage leads to a statistically significant worsening of trade balance, reducing it by amount, 0.11 to 0.27% of annual GDP. I mean, we discussed this, again, not extremely high numbers, but still, we describe this impact as economically meaningful and conclude that this external imbalance is a constraint on the minimum wage policy. But again, as I said, 0.11 to 0.27% of annual GDP, it's really not as high as feared out by classical economic theory or by mainstream economic theory, to be honest.
Okay. And so the 7th question is the given from 2065 from the 2022 monthly data. What cautions apply when generalizing results under the high inflation and FX volatility?
I mean, this is a very important methodological point, actually. Again, as I said, in such a volatile environment, especially after 2018, using this monthly data is a significant strength. I mean, it allows our SVAR model, the structural VAR model, to capture the rapid shock transmissions. I mean, for example, the almost immediate pass-through of a currency shock, let's say, to prices that will be completely averaged out and missed if we use quarterly or annual data, maybe on the alternative. But of course, there are 2 points to consider regarding generalizability. The first is, of course, structural breaks. I mean, 2005 to 2024 is the period that we are investigating, that we are using here. It's not a single stable policy regime in Turkey. I mean, it contains a period of relative stability and orthodox policy, let's say, in between 2005 and 2017, but then a period of extreme instability and unorthodox policy after 2018 up to 2023, and then return back to the rational policy after 2023 presidential elections. So, and of course, our full sample results represents an average of these different periods, so to speak. So we did attempt to address this by running a separate model for only post-2018 period, which actually interestingly found a smaller, even smaller inflationary impact. And the second point could be maybe the high noise to signal ratio. I mean, in such a volatile data set, the noise from monthly shocks can make it really difficult to statistically isolate the signal of the minimum wage through structural relationship. And this can also be, I mean, maybe why some of our findings, like the direct impact on the exchange rate or unemployment, were found to be statistically insignificant. But overall, I mean, this means our results are highly context specific, I mean, to Turkey's institutional framework.
Okay, we come for the discussion questions on the sessions. So the last question is the perspective of the discussion. So the first question is, how consistent are findings with the EM literature and how the informal wage or real wage losses limit generalizability?
I mean, our finding of minimal employment effects, first of all, is very consistent with a modern body of empirical economic literature, which has increasingly found small to zero employment effects of minimum wage, especially even in developing economies. And on the other hand, I mean, our finding of a moderate or non-zero inflationary impact is also consistent with the post-Keynesian conflict view of the inflation, which generally, as far as I have read the literature, sees wages as one factor among many, but rarely the dominant factor. And in our case, I mean, the exchange rate seems to be the dominant driver. But also, from a critical perspective, I think our macro level focus is not fully comprehensive. I mean, particularly regarding the labor market. The most significant omission, which we note in the paper, is informal employment. I mean, our model uses the official unemployment rate. It does not and cannot, of course, with the available monthly data, measure the impact on the informal sector. We do try to cite other studies in the paper on Turkey, which find that firms often respond to wage hikes not by firing workers, but by shifting them into informal, unprotected jobs. So maybe, I mean, therefore, our minimal official unemployment finding could be masking, maybe again, a significant and negative structural shift in the labor market. And similarly, again, our model tracks the price level impact, but it doesn't explicitly track the duration of the welfare gain. I mean, in a high inflation environment like Turkey, any nominal wage increase is eroded by inflation very quickly. And a point we also note in our historical review, and these factors, I mean, I believe severely limit the generalizability of the finding, or have the potential to limit the generalizability of our findings. That's why we are saying that, I mean, all results are generally highly specific to Turkey's institutional structure.
Okay, and I take notes. And the last questions on the sessions: how reliable are structure war causality claims amid inflation or FX shocks, and were indirect channels like tech, productivity, or flows considered?
So I think this is one of the most important questions here, because the causality claims in a structural VAR model are, of course, not absolute truth, right? So they are contingent on identifying assumptions, these econometric statistical assumptions we impose on the contemporaneous relationships. And we try to base our assumptions on the institutional reality of the Turkish economy as much as we can. For example, or key assumption, or one of the key assumptions is that the minimum wage is exogenous within a single month. I mean, this means basically the wage setting commission's decision does not simultaneously react to that same month's inflation or unemployment data, which can be a plausible assumption, but still, I mean, an assumption. So, I mean, we believe it's a reasonable assumption that makes the identification of a minimum wage so credible. And also our SVAR model, by its very structure, of course, inherently controls or aims to control for Granger causality, actually. I mean, by including multiple lags of all variables in the system, the model only attributes an effect to the minimum wage if its changes can predict inflation above and beyond what past inflation, past exchange rate changes, and all other variables in the model can already predict. So, I mean, this is just the very inherent nature of the SVAR models. So we also explicitly tested for co-integration and did not find it, by the way, which justifies our use of the SVAR in differences. But of course, our analysis of indirect channels is a bit limited. I mean, primarily due to the lack of high frequency monthly data for those variables. I mean, for example, productivity is the most important omitted channel here. We discussed it extensively in our theoretical framework part of the paper and cite literature suggesting wage hikes can boost productivity. And we even infer that productivity gains might be one reason the inflationary pass-through is moderate and why the trade balance effect is a complex dynamic. But we don't test it explicitly in our model because we don't have monthly measure of productivity, obviously. And similarly, maybe in 2 minutes or so, I know I am exceeding my time for this question, but I mean, channels like technology adoption, the degree of foreign competition, and maybe especially capital flows, which can be a primary driver of the exchange rate in Turkey, are not directly modeled in our paper, which is also a limitation. So this limitation means that our study gives, a very clear picture of the short-run high-frequency trade-offs, but it does not aim to explain the full underlying structural adjustments, so to speak. So we see a minimum employment effect and a moderate cost pass-through, but our model cannot tell precisely how much of that adjustment was absorbed by unmeasured productivity gains versus, say, squeezed profit margins versus a shift to informality. So this is a limitation. I mean, this limits our understanding of the policy's full long-run consequences. But still, I think we believe we try to provide, our paper provides clear empirical evidence, which is also very much in line with what the Central Bank of Republic of Turkey working papers found out about the impact of the minimum wage in their earlier bank reports or earlier studies of the research department of the central bank. That minimum wage has a small effect on various macroeconomic variables, not as feared out as policymakers or not as feared out as what the media narrative is generally saying.
Okay, thank you, professors, and thank you again for your participations. And so I want to say, yes, the closing parts on the sessions. So yes, today on the second day of the congresses, we were with Professor Ceyhun Elgin from the Bogazici University. We reviewed all the article minimum wage in a high inflation economy, the case of Turkey, with him using the 10 questions. Thank you again for your participation and the contributions, Professor. And if you want to say anything, yes, your turn.
Thank you very much for your interest in our paper. I sincerely hope that our paper will spark debate among policymakers as well as among economists, academic economists and non-academic economists in the country. Currently, it's still a working paper, by the way. We haven't published the paper yet, so it has not gone through proper editorial review or peer review, actually. But right now, it has been submitted to a journal, and it is under review there. So we'll see what the outcome is. And hopefully, once it is published, maybe our results are going to be even more credible than we are arguing, or than I'm arguing here. And also, again, I should mention this paper is a joint paper with Cem Oyvat and Adem Yavuzelveren. So, I should also make, references to them because, I need to give credit to them because they really played a very important role in writing of the paper.
Yeah, I want to say on these points, I read to this paper, so all of the articles and analysis is very, very simplified and all of the people's understanding the SVAR and Granger causality models, but it's very important empirical evidences. So I advise to please read through these articles. And so that concludes the sessions. Until next time, stay tuned.